introduce the people at the table. So I'll start with Ray Greasy.
Who's he?
Let the table accept these two gentlemen here. You'll have to introduce yourselves if you'll be first.
My name's Tom Harold. I'm an engineer with Bart.
I'm John Shiro.
This is Greg Austin. He's with Bart. This is my wife, Margaret. And this gentleman here is Meyer Riles. He's a manufacturer's rep, or was, now in business, and his lovely wife. And this is Rex Beeman, now General Electric.
And myself, Frank Thatcher Associates. You might have heard of Frank Thatcher Associates. Representing standing at the table. And to my left, I have Dave Palmer, who's with himself, and Steve Bowers with Jack Daniel, not the one of Lynchburg, Tennessee, another company. And we have Donnie and Harold Puckelow with Mobile Services Incorporated. I get it straight.
NKR.
Stan Harder, KH6GBX, Glynis Gregory, Goliath, and Dick Lamberton, and myself. We don't have call signs.
We have a new applicant.
This is Alan Zimmerly from Frank Thatcher, Steve Ambrose from Kennedy Jacks, and Bob Teal, who's the Director of Technical Services at Pasco County.
And Warren Struben. And Warren, please.
I have my wife Marge, my daughter-in-law Debbie, and this little kid over here, Keith Sacher, Scott, my son, Ron Formella, the West, Rudy Gretton, and I'm Warren McQueen. We have one other person here. I won't introduce you. No, please don't. Like I said, I could. You'll be our guest speaker.
I notice we have some people.
Charlie Hessenbach, Calvin Chow, and Brian Wood on here.
To start off, on my left here is Tim Bloss from Argo Systems, and Judy Belstrego of General Communications, Chuck and Mrs. Heron, Chuck Heron Associates, and Cliff Frazier, and Jim Lang, the former General Manager of Westcom Microwave, and now PG&E, and of course I'm Dale Detweiler.
Skip Ostier, how do you pronounce that? Ostier. Skip Ostier of Motorola, who's going to be talking about a project they're doing for East Bay Mud. And it's a very interesting project, by the way. We're also, in our next meeting, we have a rather ambitious program we're going to initiate, the DTS group. And we're looking for some new ideas, and I'll give you our new plans then. And we're also looking for 3 new officials, and you'll all be contacted, so we'll have an election that night. Well, now here we are, and we have our speaker tonight, Stu Meyer, who everyone knows, I guess, here. Stu, I just wrote down a few more comments about you. Stu was the past president of the National Nuclear Technology Society, the chairman of the APCO Commercial Advisory Committee, director of NABOR, executive vice president of Radio Club of America, and chairman of the panel on telecommunications for EIA, and there's a number of other offices he's held. Well, with that, I'm going to introduce Stu Meyer.
And how many Radio Club of America members do we have? How many members of both? I also say I did a few presentations before amateur radio club. I did the W6VIP. And when I was doing a job in San Francisco, this job, I had the opportunity of preparing before many clubs. I came out of the Navy in 1945, a friend of mine, pre-arranged an introduction for me with Fred Link. And before I went into service, I reached that status in life where I bought a brand new car, a Master Deluxe 1940 Chevrolet for $815. But the draft came along, and I was in that first group, so I was also a Naval Reserve, and I volunteered for a year of active duty, which they multiplied by 5. That wasn't too bad either. When I came home, all my folks had during the war years was a duration book, and here's this brand new Chevrolet with a paper wrapping, with the panels on the door again. I figured, well, I'm going to take a 6-month trip around the country and visit all my buddies. I made the mistake, it really wasn't a mistake, it turned out, taking up the invitation and having lunch with Fred Link, and nobody explained to me then it was a liquid lunch. It was going to be a liquid lunch, and this was like a Thursday, and the net result was the following Monday, I went to work for Link Radio and had 6 months dripping down the drain. But you've heard the approach before, there's the good news and the bad news. Well, it just so happened when I started at Link Radio, I was a design engineer. You'll see a little bit of that on the slideshow. And it turned out I was assigned a laboratory assistant to wire all the prototypes before they go into production. And her name was and still is today Lottie, and she's my wife. So she's not here tonight, but she does make many of these meetings with me. Last weekend we went to Finger Lakes, New York, to an Antique Wireless Association meeting. And we are going to Florida at the end of the month, so that's enough traveling for her, she says. I have reached that status in life where I now have in the pocket one of those Eastern Airlines senior citizens, as they call them. And I bought one 3 years ago for my wife and myself, and she got so fed up with being on the road every other week, she says, please, no more, you're going to travel yourself. I recently retired from the E.F. Johnson Company. As a matter of fact, to be specific, June 30th. I didn't retire, I'm still quite busy finding time, not only finding the time, but trying to find the time to do a lot of things I wanted to do. I'm fairly active, and I continue to be active. Amateur radio does take up a fair part of my life, including the political side. I finished 4 years as president of the Central Wireless Association last year. And I'm looking for new tours now. Something's about to happen. I do have some bad, I think it's serious for a moment, I do have some bad news. In the Radio Club of America, we had a very dedicated person named Jack Clara. Those of you who go back some years, you'll hear about WOR stations in New York City programming. I called home a few hours ago and I was told that Jack passed away this morning. Feeling like being very active. So we have that sad note. The Radio Club of America does have an annual awards banquet every year, a symposium year after the banquet and the award evening, and that is traditionally the Friday of the weekend before Thanksgiving, and it takes place at the New York Athletic Club. Here. In the Vehicle Technology Society, I am the senior past president. We are having a board meeting the week after next in Dearborn, Michigan. I'll be out there then. BTS has been a very rewarding challenge for me. First came to work for RCA in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the government types of people called me up and said, would you by any chance accept the job as Secretary of Treasury of the local chapter? And I did. And I became chairman of the chapter. And I was able to get enough activity and keep enough balls juggling up in the air that we won the Chapter of the Year award. And I became involved in the board of Vehicle Technology and president. So it's a very rewarding challenge, very rewarding opportunity. And I look to both BTS, Vehicle Technology Society, Radio Club of America, and the 20th Century Wireless Association. Some of the better things I've done. I did play around a little bit with two-way radio, predominantly amateur radio before World War II. I came on the air on the 116-meter band in 1931, and I got my license in 1933. Now, I had to put everything in perspective. Back then, it was fashionable bootleg. Maybe throw a book at you. Latest FCC motto is, we're deregulating, and therefore we have fewer rules, and we can more effectively enforce those fewer rules. And as the saying goes, you ain't seen nothing yet. The scene in Washington has changed very drastically in recent years. A two-way radio operator, or broadcaster, amateur radio operator, things are a lot different today. One of the latest proposals that just came out of the commission is that they propose to contract out the giving of technical examinations to operators and so forth where they're needed. And so, with a general move of deregulation, and as the saying goes on the streets of Washington, D.C., if you can't regulate it, then deregulate it. That's one way of solving the problem. Washington is a town of lawyers predominantly in communication circles these days. The engineer is going, fortunately, for a guy like me, there are plenty of hands in the commission. And so you can usually, I would say they bend the rules, or you can find it maybe a little bit easier. The saying goes that you and I, as youngsters, are probably, heaven is up there and hell is down there. But in reality, they're side by side. There's a big chain link fence separating heaven and hell. And one day, God was walking his grounds, and he saw a big hole cut in this chain link fence, and not very far away was the devil. And he said to the devil, "Do you know anything about that hole in the fence?" The devil said, "Yeah, I cut it." And God said, "What would you want to do a thing like that for?" I said, "Well, I'm getting damn sick and tired of my constituents griping all the time about how good it is on your side of the fence and how miserable it is over here. And I just thought I'd find out for myself and check these stories out." God said, "You know better than that. It's been determined and deemed that for eternity. You have your side of the fence, I have mine. That's the way it's going to be forever." He said, "Furthermore, I want you to patch that hole in the fence." And the devil began to walk away, and God called him back. And he said, "Listen, I want that hole patched, and I want it done by 6 o'clock tonight." And the devil laughed. He said, "You out of your mind." Walked away. With that, God shouted out, "If it's not fixed by 6 o'clock tonight, I'll sue you." And there was a pause, and the devil said, "Where are you going to find a lawyer on your side of the fence?" Long time ago, there were two potatoes who fell in love with each other. And they got married. And before very long, little Tater came along. Little Tater had a good life, good education, good job, moved away from home. And one Friday night, little Tater called up and said to the parents, "I'm coming home. I got some fantastic news to tell you." So little Tater came home, and the parents just couldn't wait to hear it. So it was kind of late when she arrived. Next morning, at the breakfast, Mother Tater said, "Well, tell us this good news. I'm going to get married." And Father said, "To who?" And David said, "To Dan Rather." That's a kind of shock. He said, "I like your approval." And the mother and father said, "Well, this is quite a shock to us. You go meet with your friends and enjoy yourself. And before you leave on Sunday, we'll give you our decision." So Sunday afternoon came, the table was getting ready to leave. "Well, Mommy and Daddy, I'm so impatient, I can't really what's your approval?" And Father Tater said, "Well, I'm very sorry, we just can't give you approval." And we were kind of crying, and then Tater said, "Why not?" "Well, after all, Dan Rather is only a commentator." Can we turn the slide on? You might want to rearrange your chair so you can better see the screen. Turn around.
Flip the left light switch off.
Let you have eyes on the back of your head. Well, let's digress a minute. This particular show tonight was Mark II Fred Link Base Station. Most of you know Fred Link, and I think you'd appreciate that. Next slide. In the 20s, broadcasting in the United States usually started at noon. And on Thursday night, at least on the East Coast, the broadcasters went off the air for a couple of hours. So you could listen in to stations from overseas, predominantly from Europe. And then you would write a little report in the local newspaper's radio column, and you would see a name mentioned in the paper that following week. Anyway, a department store group that I used to work for, John Wanamaker, had a store in New York City and a store in Philadelphia, and they both had AM broadcast stations. So in order to put the stations to good use, next slide please, they would talk between stations in the morning, point to point, and exchange warehouse information, payroll information, that sort of thing. And this is a true story. It was the first use of point-to-point business radio. And of course, they would talk in the receivers looking something like this. Next slide. The first use of radio for dispatching vehicles on the street really started with the police departments. And operating just above the broadcast band with 50-watt transmitters, a number of these stations came on the air, talking out one way, a very crude form of paging. Next. And here is one of the test vehicles of New York City Police Department going back into the mid-20s. And they did have more modern vehicles than that too. Next, please. The trouble with this installation is that you had to be very careful on a windy day taking the corner. A couple of things about radio back then. We did have radios and automobiles, very luxury item. The running boards were actually insulated from the car body, and in many installations, the running board was the antenna for the broadcast receiver. Next slide. And those receivers were powered by B batteries. You already had 6 volts in the vehicle for the A battery. And these, well, F-Ready is only one of them, makes sort of 4 or 5 of them. This is nothing but really a whole bunch of flashlight cells molded in the block. And this has a 45-volt battery, and generally speaking, the B voltages back then, either 90 volts with 2 batteries, 135 volts with 3 of them, and 180 with 4. And of course, the batteries would only last so long. And as a kid in high school, I used to go scrounging in the neighborhood, especially on the other side of the track where people had more money, and they would discard their batteries with more useful life in than the people on the side of the tracks I lived on. And I would get another week or two, or a couple of weeks use out of them for experimenting and playing with radios. Next slide. The automobile radios, and of course the communication mobile receivers back then, took a big step forward in getting rid of the B batteries when a fellow by the name of Bill Lear, the inventor of the Lear jet, invented a vibrator. And all a vibrator did was interrupt the DC into the primary of a transformer because you got AC out of the secondary. And mobile radio back then also took advantage of that. Back in those days, the vibrator power supply was a separate box from the receiver. And we've come a long way since then, of course. I gave this talk at one meeting, and some kid raised his hand and said, "What's a vibrator?" So if anybody doesn't know what a vibrator is, it's a mechanical gadget to chop up direct current, make it pulsating DC, and of course the transformer change to AC. Next. That's a log of public safety radio systems in use around the country. Back in the late 20s, I guess, this was reprinted in, the Apple Bulletin, March 71. This is supposed to be a 31-32 list. Let's see, we're in California last time I checked up. The city of Berkeley was on 24-22. Vallejo, 24-22 also. I guess they got mutual aid. Pasadena and Los Angeles, 17-12, right in the broadcast band. And San Francisco on 15-58. As a matter of fact, up until maybe 20 years ago, you could tune to the high end of the broadcast band in this country and still hear a few public safety organizations. Now, most of these started out as being one way, and of course the problem with that is that the officer in the vehicle had to stop the vehicle car and look for a callback and tell the dispatcher he received the message. Some early scenes of dispatch positions. I think I was in New York City. Two-way radio really did not get a good strong start in the big cities. It started in the smaller towns. And a former president of the Quarter Century Wireless Association by the name of Frank Gunther, who was then working for the Radio Engineering Laboratories in Long Island City, REL, used some 5-meter amateur band equipment to demonstrate to police departments that they could really go in for two-way radio using AM equipment. And so Frank made a demonstration before the Bayonne police departments of all organizations. And then, of course, as it had to do, the book says you have to go out to bid. And Fred Link, being who the country back then, was low bidder. And this is a fleet of about 1932, 31, 32 of the Bayonne City Police Department, two-way radio system where the driver could talk back to the dispatcher without having to stop the vehicle and look for a call box. It was AM in the 30 to 40 megahertz band. This is back in the days when there were more frequencies than there were customers. The channels were a half megahertz apart. The transmitters were in the 10 to 15, 20 watt range. The early receivers were super regenerative rush boxes, very crude, but effective, they worked. Next slide. An early AM police transmitter looked something like this. Those of you with an amateur background, it's a 6L6 tri-cal oscillator, whose plate current was only exceeded by the crystal current. Driving an 807 doubling, into a Collins Pi network with those two vertical adjustments, and a 6A6 high-level Class B modulator, and another 6A6 parallel as a driver, and a dynamotor. And the receiver was in a box something like that, went side by side. Tim Glass is operating this projector, and I want you to know he's operating under very difficult conditions because at the last minute, the projector stopped advancing when you hit the go button. And so he's synchronizing it, and so if we have to stop and find a coin to open up the thing and straighten it out, please bear with us, but he's doing a great job. This is what a typical AM transmitter looked like back in the 30s. Those of you with an amateur background might be interested in knowing the final stages consisted of a pair of TZ40s, Taylor zero bias tubes, a pair of TZ40s high-level modulators. I bought one of these transmitters at $25 from the Jersey City Police Department, and before the days of nostalgia, I ripped it apart and converted the cabinet into a tool cabinet for power tools, steel saws, electric drills, and things of that nature. I can kick myself now, and I'm still saying to myself, is it worth finding all the parts in the attic, because I never throw anything away. Which makes it almost impossible to move. I think it took me 6 months to move from Raleigh, North Carolina to the end of Virginia. And it took me 2 years, I think, to get everything out of my house in New Jersey and bring it down to my house down south. Anyway, that's kind of what the transmitters look like. Those of you who remember the old R9 magazine out here on the West Coast may remember seeing, well, its name was merged with radio. And Frank Jones out here or somebody else, well, this kind of an AM transmitter, TZ40 and what have you. Now these systems operated just above the 10-meter band. And those of you back then with a single conversion 10-meter receiver could hear the police departments on UHF. It was called UHF back then. This is even called VHF today. Now some of the early systems were hybrid. They used the old AM HF talk out and then had a 30 megahertz transmitter talk back into the base station. And that worked better than nothing, but it didn't leave much to be desired. I'll hear a little bit more about that later next. I can't read it from here, but that's Bergen County, New Jersey, of course, was one of the pioneers of two-way radio in the 30s. By this time, places like New York City and San Francisco and Los Angeles were still talking out on AM, and only a few cars had talkback. Next. This is known as Fred Link's 1-horsepower mobile installation. When I first went to work for Link Radio about October 22nd, 1945, regardless of what job you came in as, you had to go down the test department line, and you were the gopher. And since this horse to just about make it to the warehouse and back to the plant to bring the parts over to keep the production line going, there was no generator on this wagon to keep the battery charged. So the Gophers had to change the batteries. And one thing you learn fast is that don't let your tie go wipe across the top of the battery with the acid and so forth. Otherwise, your tie began to get shorter and shorter. Next. That was low bandage, you can see. At the close of World War II, this is what a typical trunk installation looked like in the vehicle. The cabinet on the left was the transmitter, with powers from 25 to 75 watts, and the cabinet on the right is the receiver. The receiver had its own vibrator power supply, and since we had both negative ground and positive ground systems then, you change the polarity of the receiver by taking the vibrator out, like a socket, and turning it 180 degrees. And you might be interested in the side story, why did we have negative ground and why do we have positive ground systems? Well, it turned out that as the automobiles began to get somewhat more sophisticated, it was learned that both Ford and Chrysler products had an electrolysis problem with the radiator. The ground return current of the headlights would flow through the radiator, and that caused an electrolysis condition which ate out the core. And the way that problem was solved is reverse the polarity of the electrical system. For whatever reason, mechanically otherwise, General Motors didn't have that problem. So those of you who go back far enough, and there are a few of you who do, just looking at you. Yeah. Well, you say, you forget I was trained by Fred Link. Tell it as it is. And if you don't know it, fake it anyway. And so we had negative ground, positive ground systems. The transmitter had a dynamotor, and police use required, you had to keep the battery up at night when either the car was standing still or cruising at a very low speed with the headlights on. And so a company called Lees Neville came up with a mobile alternator with a very big copper oxide rectifier that mounted between the grill and the radiator, and of course the fan air coming through kept it cool. And this alternator with this rectifier had a very small pulley so that when the engine was idling, the generator, the alternator, would keep the battery afloat, able to provide power. One problem with that system was that when you hit the mic button on the 75-watt unit, the inrush current was so great in the alternator, in the dynamotor, the engine would stall. That's a true story. Next slide. We've come a long way since then. At the close of World War II, this is what a typical low-band FM base station looked like. During the war years, it was proven that FM was definitely better than AM. So when I came to work for Link Radio, we were right in the midst of the transition. We were making AM, we were making FM, and sometimes both. Unintentionally, of course, but sometimes both. And this was a 250TH iMac tube in the final, right, fresh from the West Coast down here from Idle McCullough. And a pair of 807s driving it, running about 600 watts input and just about squeezing 300 watts output. 2 receivers, rack receivers, and depending upon the system makeup, one receiver, of course, was to go with the transmitter. The other one could be on a second frequency for car-to-car direct communication to monitor that, or to have a 2-frequency setup, talk out on one, talk out on the second frequency called half duplex, or to monitor the sheriff's department or the state police or what have you. That was pretty much a standard of the industry. And also, those of you who know, and I've read R9 and radio magazines years back, as a high school kid, I used to be able to buy those magazines on the East Coast for a quarter, and I still have one with a pair of those 250THs and an amateur rig. And the article heading on the front cover is, modern up-to-date push-pull amplifier. One pushy, one pulley, working like hell. Next slide. State police and a few others went in for wide area systems with fixed receivers at various places. And this is back in the days when you could afford telephone lines to do this sort of thing. No slam in the telephone industry, but things have really changed, I think we'll all agree to that. This is a 3,000 watt output. That was a Link 3000 UFS, a pair of iMac Tetrodes by this time, driven by the same 807 exciter. And we had one guy, West Production down in Texas, who put one of these in. and he missed no bones with the commission. He flew a DC-3 up with venison and passed it out to all the commissioners, got a license on 30.02, which had the best skip rate of anything, and talked back and forth to the Link factory ordering parts and stuff like that. Somewhat illegal, but nevertheless. What else is new? Next slide. Now, at the close of World War II, the FCC did do a couple of very bold things. First of all, it created high band. Up till now, we were 30 to 40 and 30 to 44. Then, incidentally, some of you might want to know why, if you have Channel 1 on your TV set, many sets did have it, we don't have Channel 1 today. And what happened during the war years, when the TV allocations were made, it was planned to have a Channel 1. At the end of World War II, the Commission did some juggling around and created more land mobile spectrum by going from 30 to 44 megs, and doing that, they took away Channel 1. So the history of the TV industry losing spectrum to land mobile is not new. It started back in World War II. And then the amateur 5 meter band was changed to the 6 meter band, so we never did have Channel 1 in actual use in this country. Anyway, the first high band block was from 150 to 162 megahertz. That was one thing the Commission did. Another thing they did is they opened eligibility. Up until now, you had to be a police department or heavy industrial. There just weren't that many land mobile eligibility brackets for getting a license. The biggest thing the Commission did, along with going to high band, is they created the business radio service. Next slide. And that was one real bold step. As we went to high band, television came along at the same time. And so our transmitters had some shielding. That glass window now, you can't exactly see the tube behind it. There's some shielding in there now to minimize television interference. Next. No problem? Problem? Oh, there you go. Back. Got a problem? Down. All right, let me just say a couple of things. Along with creating the taxi cab radio service, the business radio comes a little bit later, the Commission also created the common carrier radio service. And they created two of them. The telephone companies, or Landwire, and the miscellaneous, as they were known back then, the MCCs, which basically were telephone answering services that also provided radio communications. And the early miscellaneous common carriers provided mobile telephone service. One of the members of the Radio Club of America who passed away not too recently, but he did accomplish one thing before passing away. He finally won a case against Motorola for patent infringement. He designed a system called Dial Direct. And from his little garage in Richmond, Indiana, with a 20-foot high antenna, he had a small MCC back then, and you could dial from car to car or car to a local landline number and that sort of thing. And this was like in the late 40s, mid-40s to late 40s when that happened. So mobile telephones, as such, really go back a long way. They were very crude back then, but they were working systems. Next. Go on to the next one. When the Commission came out with the high band, some of the other outfits for a short period of time got into business. Federal, which is now known as IT&T, went after the taxi cab market from high band. Next. Philco also got into business back then, which many of you may not realize. And we had a joke in the industry then. They didn't last very long, and we said their problem was that their shipments were only received by their returns. They didn't know how to quite make a good two-way radio. Next. Then the Commission did do another bold thing and created the business radio service. And all you had to do to have your own private radio system was be a legitimate business. Or you say it was legitimate anyway. And apply for a license. You had your own little radio system. You start out on high band first, simplex channels. Next. A fellow in Raleigh, North Carolina, by the name of Charlie Browning, was producing this lunch bucket radio for airport use in the AM band around 120 megahertz. And even back then, federal regulations required that any vehicle that operated on a federally funded runway had to be able to talk to the control tower. So this little radio plugged into the cigarette lighter, and you had a good amount clip you could clip on the car. And Charlie, when business radio was created, quickly redesigned this radio for FM and for 150 megahertz with a very sensitive front end. And then he sent a bunch of suede shoe salesmen out with one radio in each hand. And he put one of them on the receptionist's desk with the secretary, what have you, with a little rib antenna, and take the boss, the manager, what have you, out for a ride in the car around the block with a good amount of antenna, plug it into a cigarette lighter, and so forth. He'd say, see, Mr. Jones, how clear the signals are, how well it works, just like how much better it's going to be when you put a 100-foot tower up in your backyard. And the idea was to close on the first sale. This was a very unique radio. It had, and now we're into the 50s, mid-50s, and this is when the automotive industry was changing over to 12 volts. So we had a lot of 6-volt vehicles on the street, a lot of 12-volt vehicles, a lot of heavy-duty fire trucks and heavy-duty vehicles with 12 volts, negative ground, positive ground. And so by the makeup, the wiring of the connector that went in the back of this radio, it worked with 117 volts AC, 6 volts negative ground, 6 volts positive ground, 12 volts negative ground, 12 volts positive ground. These were all simplex frequency assignments. So if your base station went out at nights or weekends, you grab one of the mobile units, plug it in, and you didn't have to pay any overtime rates to get the radio fixed. And it was very effective. So effective that General Electric went after them and came out with the Pacer, a small underdash unit, modestly priced, to go after the business radio market. And not to be undone, Motorola came out with a small radio, which they modified from motorcycle radio, and they call that the business dispatcher, but the industry called it the Pacer Chaser. Next slide. No problem. Leave it much, this is the way it was, okay, good. Aerotron also modified that radio design and put a 12-channel selector on it. And it was a small craft VHF radio because the commission also started a movement to move a lot of marine stuff off of the HF band and go VHF. And Aerotron, when I was with them, made these units for Raytheon and under two names, the Raytheon name and the Apelco name. So I made many trips to South San Francisco when the Raytheon plant was there. Next. Hammerland also copied the Aerotron approach with a same universal power supply. This was known as the Outercom, manufactured by Hammerland, but marketed by a group in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it was after that same fundamental the business radio market. Next slide. Another that's not a sure mic, it's not a static mic, that is a turner microphone with the button on the front so that when you reach to the dash and pick it up, you didn't have an unnatural movement to put the microphone up to your face. The commission did another very bold thing in the 50s. It authorized some experimental frequencies at 450 megahertz. So my wife and I, working for Fred Link, built some transmitters. They two tubes, which were the old Amperex AX9903s, now known as the 5894, tripled the output of a 150 transmitter, and then amplified it to 15 watts. And the upper left-hand corner was a converter to convert the 450 signals down to 150. We made up 50 of these units, and we loaned 25 of them to Chicago Checker Cab and 25 to Detroit Checker Cab. And the drivers then had to switch on the front panel, and whenever they got to a dead spot, they could check it and see whether they got communications, whether it was dead on 150 or vice versa. But they also had an ulterior motive. Around this time, an outfit in Indianapolis was making a little monitor receiver you could put under the dash of the car. And one of the big markets for those receivers then were the taxi cabs who didn't have radios, and they would monitor the taxi cab systems with radios to steal the calls. And so one of the advantages 450 had, for a while, it gave some semi-privacy. So we were one of the pioneers of link radio at 450 and UHF. And Checker Cab came to us in Detroit and said, no, we really think this is the way to go. We have 897 cabs, and on a rainy payday night, it's murder in this town. You know, we had a very big, complex system. And with all those tear-jerking stories that we filed, the commission only came out with 3 channels. And 3 channels and 897 cabs on a rainy payday night doesn't quite work very well. So, at this time, link radio was having its problems. That unit then, after the successful demonstrations, went into production, and we made that radio for ourselves and also for RCA with the RCA Umber Great Paint. And I think it was called the RCA CMU-10A. And then when Fred Link sold his business, he and myself and a few others went to Dumont and put Dumont in the mobile radio business. And you know, by some strange coincidence, the Dumont mobile units were physically and electrically interchangeable with link radio units. Strange coincidence. And so that same design went in production with Dumont Green, and then we private labeled them for Bendix, with Bendix Blue. Next slide. When 450 megacycles came about, the commission did another very smart thing back then, and it separated the base station and mobile frequencies by exactly 5 megahertz. And this made possible the mobile relay, which made possible the community repeater. The mobile relay had the advantage that the mobiles could talk to each other and get the same range as the base station provided with a tall antenna and a good sight and all that. And telephone line rates would begin to climb then, and a few telephone companies got wise to a gimmick. And when they realized we were doing 2 or 3 things on one telephone pair, they started charging by the function rather than by the number of metallic pairs that we used. And the mobile relay has the advantage that if you take a mobile unit and put it on a desk with an AC power supply and a fixed antenna, it can dispatch through the repeater and eliminate telephone line charges. As you go higher in frequency, you need better antenna sites, as you'll see, and usually these are on top of tall buildings, mountains, hills, what have you. And so the community repeater came about in that you could have a number of users use a common repeater, share the expenses, and by using different tone squelch frequencies, subaudible tones that you couldn't hear in the loudspeakers, you could have a fair amount of discipline on the channel, and that Group A would have tone A and Group B tone B. Admittedly, they could step on each other to some extent, but that was a lot better than having multiple base stations competing with each other in the same channel in the same geographical area. Next slide. Of course, as I said before, we eliminated telephone lines. Now, getting back to Detroit Checker Cab came to us and said that we'd like to buy 897 mobile units with a few spares if you could solve this FCC problem. Well, I guess the FCC wasn't much different then than it is now, despite all these great things you hear. And it was a very slow process. And we needed that order bad to keep the lines rolling, people employed, make the payroll. So not knowing any better, we designed a cellular system back in 1948. And we broke up the city of Detroit into 8 cells. We called them zones back then. We didn't have that zip word, cell. And it was so laid out that no 2 zones or cells were on the same frequency. And all of the vehicles were equipped with a map on plastic, which was attached to the sun visor. And it only took the driver 3 or 4 days to memorize, so when they were in a certain part of town, they switched to a certain channel. So we had a manual handoff. Now, we had a few problems with the system, as people are having today. We didn't have the variety of antenna products that we had today. And if you can visualize a Thursday night in a bar at the Statler Hilton in Detroit, with a fellow by the name of Jim Craig and myself about 1 o'clock in the morning saying, what the hell are we going to do to solve a problem? We had a problem that there was cell jumping. You get good coverage and everything. The antennas were only about 70 feet off the ground. but Zone 1 might jump into Zone 3 in certain parts of town. It would override what was supposed to be the regular transmitter. Well, in order to keep the coverage down, we use very simple antennas, unity gain. And unity gain antennas have one bad characteristic. They have kind of a high angle of radiation. And I can still remember talking to Jim at the bar, and I'm at the 7th Scotch and Water, saying, you know, Jim, here's what the pattern looks like. What if you climb the Detroit Leland Hotel tonight, by now it's 2 o'clock, and turn the antenna 180 degrees, and now we'd have a down-tilt umbrella antenna. And that's what we did. The problem was so serious that we only had about 300 radios installed, and the cab company was not going to accept any more. And Fred Link was looking for us to get back the installation certificate so we could run to the bank and factor it. And those of you in business know what I'm talking about, factoring. So we did this, and we checked a taxi cab out of the garage. We drove around the city. And 8 o'clock the next morning, we were in Carl Anderson's office. Carl is the president of the company. He says, my God, for people like you, got to put a smile on your face. You must be taking something that you're all hyped up. And I said, well, Carl, we're just going to ask you one thing. Take a ride with us. We took them around town. They called a special meeting of the board of directors. They gave us the certificates. We released the go-ahead. And we got a good tailwind on the conveyor flying through the Newark. And Fred Link is in the front of the place saying, where the hell were you guys? And he said, Fred, it's like this. You want to ball us out, but you want this installation certificate. What do you think? Anyway, so that's the case of having your back against the wall, and you had to do something and do it fast, and not knowing any better. We went to frequency reuse back then. I did make 13 trips in 1958. As we got into the mid-50s, municipalities and cities and towns had more and more money to operate and update their radio systems. So when we were at Dumont, we were successful bidder for an updated police radio system for the city and county of San Francisco, and so I got my way around town. And I stayed at the Press Club in San Francisco the last couple of nights at very attractive rates. And Frank actually said it's just a short walk up to the St. Francis. And I learned at breakfast that morning that they had picked up all the sidewalks in the street with extra dirt under these hills. As I tell you, I really felt it when I got to the top of that hill. That was the first morning I was here. The second morning, Frank took me up, I think. That was this morning, by the way. So anyway, next slide. We got the job. Now, at this time, the San Francisco Police Department, it was just something that dispatching and radio just kind of grew one piece on top of another. Most of the units had a receiver only in them. Only 40 cars could talk back to the dispatcher in the second half of the 50s. And so we had to install a new system, two-way and everything, and we had to keep the old system going at the same time so that as the weeks went by, the city had more communications and not less. And it was quite an ordeal. Next slide. The radio room had a console with conveyor belts so that the telephone operators picked up messages. They had IBM cards that were dropped in the conveyor system. Came to a dispatcher. The dispatcher had some lever keys. This was a 4-channel system, basically, with some additional channels for other things. It was basically low band with some high band. All the marked cars in the city had one frequency. All the unmarked cars had another frequency, and the motorcycle squad had a third frequency. But every mobile had a common second frequency, which by FCC rules was a mobile-only frequency, no base stations allowed on it. And so if a officer in the field was in trouble, and the dispatcher was giving out an APB at all points forward, the guy in the field could override him. If a motorcycle was chasing somebody and wanted help, he could ask for a repeat function, and by manipulating those levers, whatever the driver of the motorcycle was saying would go out on the other channels. There was also a high band channel for the broadcaster and Meyer and a few other people who probably rated to every communication back then. And then there were little thumb controls that lit various colored lights in a big display panel. There's one panel for every car. And by just looking at those panels, you could tell what shape the communication was in. I think a white light indicated routine, and a green light was out of service. A blue light was out of service temporarily for meals or what have you. And the red light, of course, was in pursuit or what have you. And then next. Those of you who remember the days of Conrad, on the right-hand side of that map, you'll see the car, KAAR, Frank Pinocchio should know something about. The Conrad receiver to meet FCC regulations, and once in a while that turned on. And then every precinct had a cluster of 4 lights. That was assigned to the lead vehicle in that precinct, so the sergeant in charge of communications could look at the lights and tell whether things were in normal shape for a rainy payday night and that sort of thing, and get an idea of what shape the city was in as far as assignment of vehicles. Next. The transmitters and antennas were up on Twin Peaks, and this building had double emergency power, so if the city power failed, an emergency generator kicked in and would not kick out until the city power was restored for a contiguous 5 minutes. And then, if the emergency power failed, a second emergency unit would kick in. Next. One of the requirements of the contract is that we had to take measures to minimize overtime maintenance costs. This goes back to the days when the New York papers were carrying headlines about garbage collectors in San Francisco making $100 a week, whatever it was back then, driving salary. So every channel had 2 transmitters, an A and a B. And these were controlled over telephone lines. The city had their own telephone lines, so there was no question of the lines for it. And this is an actual on-the-air action shot. You can see the red lights, fire lights, transmit lights. And every morning at 8 o'clock, the new sergeant coming on duty would flip the other transmitter regardless. And if he lost communications, at least he'd get that repaired during the day at regular rates instead of overtime rates. That was one thing. Next. We had some nice towers to work with. One of the requirements was that if all 3 transmitters on simultaneously, the emergency channel receivers couldn't be greater more than half a dB, and we used such things as putting antennas one over the other to operate the nodes and use crystal fluid in the receiver and other things. I can remember coming out here, and the fog some night would be so thick that when I drove the Twin Peaks to that radio shack, I had to get out of the car and get down and feel the dent in the curb where the driveway was into the service area. And you could hear the plop, plop, plop when the bush falling out of the fog. You down Market Street, you could see the moonlight. Of course, San Francisco wasn't the only city doing lots of money and modernized communications. Los Angeles, most vouch. Those of you who are in the land mobile industry I know about the recent accomplishment of the famous Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department getting the commission pushed into the direction of creating another public safety land mobile channel by taking it away from TV. Next. Other, helicopter radio is very common today. Next. My phone snapped through good enough. We went around full circle and paging came back. One-way communications was a very important part of our business. So important that these miscellaneous common carriers, when they got respect, as Rodney Dayton was saying, got their name changed to radio common carriers, they loaded their channels with all talk-out transmissions, and paging is a very important part of the two-way radio industry today, even though it's only one-way communication, but it's a very important part. Next slide. Motorcycle radio seems to come and go. Some cities swear by them, others swear at them. In the Washington, D.C. area, Reaganomics has really flourished the motorcycle radio business because you can no longer walk into the FCC and go to the counter and get copies of this and copies of that and so forth. And we put out a little number of copies, you have to sign up for a duplicating service on subscription basis. Some of these things break at the last minute, and motorcycle operators are dispatched here and there to make emergency pickups, duplicate them, and get them to the various clients. And then you actually go park a motorcycle where you can't park a car on a sidewalk, for instance, and get away with it. Next slide. For a period of time, there was all kinds of money available to increase public safety communications. The Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, or LEA, as it was nicknamed, had funding money available, and to get some of that money, all you had to say is that we are going to provide communications that we don't have now, and in lots of cases you could just equip every police officer with a portable radio, and it was very easy to get that funding, and of course, as a result, the handheld radio market flourished. I don't know what Chuck is whispering to Judy, but maybe it's some wisecrack about the tac-tac.
That's the only good radio they ever built, too.
Well, it depends who you talk to. Something else the commission allowed happened is the use of a vehicular repeater. You know, with a handheld portable, generally speaking, you can hear for greater distances and you can transmit back. And by having a black box in a vehicle, the police officer can change the other channel on his handheld and talk through a unit through the mobile transfer, which makes a vehicular repeater. And this is the base station direct. And in more recent years, the commission allows virtually everybody to use this technique now. It's not extremely popular, but it's, you know, it's a broad form of communication, other applications. Yes. RCA came out with a box manufactured out here in California, by the way, called Voice Plus. It was manufactured by Chandra Pinsky and Ridax. And basically, it was a digital communications technique where a burst was sent about 3 seconds in duration, identified the vehicle, and it had a status button and also a message button, the more popular ones. And there was also some thumb wheels that you could use, the less popular 10 signals, that sort of thing. And out on Long Island, we took that status board thing that you saw and built a interface box, which meant that regardless of what the police officer would say, the status light would give the true indication. Of course, by this time, we've gone to completely transistorized equipment, and in public safety, don't turn them off. They're always on in cars in the garage. And by wiring this unit to the seatbelt switch and pulling the vehicles periodically, regardless of what the driver says, this thing is going to come back and say, driver out of the vehicle, unless somebody has their rear end nestled in the front seat of the car. And this comes in very handy on checking the police officers like 2 o'clock in the morning when they pull up the Golden Arch driving window and they'll forward in the same car telling stories. And the dispatcher calls and everyone says ready to do it. Simon or ready for a call or something like that. We had some problems with unions on that score. Another application of this kind of thing is in ready-mix concrete. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ready-mix concrete business, but when you have a ready-mix concrete truck going down the street and that drum is not turning, you got a crisis developing pretty fast. So, by wiring some sensors to this thing, it can send signals back to the dispatcher, and of course the dispatcher knows what's going on, or he should know. And they have some other places maybe close by where they can get rid of the cement before somebody has to get out there with a pick and a shovel and a hammer and try and break it all loose. And there are many applications in digital. It's really coming on strong now as you realize that later. Commission's rules have greatly relaxed also in recent years. Something else that's happening in our industry in the attempt to get more spectrum is the implementation now of amplitude-companded sideband. Amplitude-companded sideband is a form of single sideband where not only do you compress the signal going into the transmitter, the audio signal, but you send a pilot signal out, shown there, and the receiver then expands the audio in inverse proportion to the compression going into the transmitter. And as a result, it sounds like a system with good voice recognition, good dynamic range, and better signal-noise ratio. One of the problems with ACSB, amplitude-companded sideband, is there's been no place to virgin spectrum to try it out. And so the Commission has recently authorized a interleaving or a sandwich system of trying to squeeze it in. And it's taken off rather slowly, so slowly that maybe, if we aren't careful, some new form of modulation, advanced form will come in and take over, and ACSP will never get the chance to prove itself. The systems are going in slow. There are two companies making it today. One is Aerotron in Raleigh, North Carolina. The other is an outgrowth of the sideband engineers, SPE, on the west coast of the United States. But you may hear some more about that next year or two. And that's what the sideband unit looks like. It looks like that band unit, line control, structure control. Ironically, the information on the pilot tone is FM, by the way, very narrow band FM. That includes the tone scrolls. And the pilot tone also provides automatic frequency control. You don't get the off frequency Donald Duck effect and that sort of thing. Next slide. That's working right. And of course, our systems are getting more sophisticated. Consoles themselves in the land mobile industry become a business call to themselves. You're doing very well, Tim. Well, in more recent years, the buzzword, the big thing is 800 megahertz. From 10 years thereabouts, actually we'll start before then, the Commission took TV channel 70 through 83 away from the TV industry and gave them the land mobile. And so we have been implementing a variety of 800 megahertz systems for land mobile. Next. One of the big things you hear a lot about, cellular. And cellular is nothing but today, is nothing but an extension of the old Detroit system that Think Radio put in. But it's refined. It has automatic switching when the vehicle goes from one cell to the next. You don't use the same frequency in adjacent cells, so you can reuse the frequencies over and over again. And the overall design is such that as traffic density gets heavier in certain parts of the city, you can make the cells smaller and reuse the frequencies more often. When you get to the suburbs, you can make the cells bigger. Next. We started out, and it doesn't get I guess it doesn't get in mind now, with a trial cellular system in Chicago with 6 or 8 cells. And when the Vehicle Technology Society had its annual conference in Chicago about that time, Bell really went all out. Anybody could hop in a car and take a ride and call home regardless of where you lose mistakes and that sort of thing. And we moved with a very high quality mobile telephone. That was a wireline system. A second system that was installed in the Baltimore, Washington corridor by a non-wireline carrier. And that's going on today. Of course, in the meantime, the Commission has made cellular the operating system, and the competition for non-wireline or non-telephone company assignments. And incidentally, during the various petitions for reconsideration, the Commission backed away from the original plan of only having wireline operators in every city, now having competing as 2 services, 2 licensees in every market area, one a wireline or telephone company, a telco, and the other a non-wireline operator. And the competition for these assignments is such that at the present time, the Commission has been auctioning these things, not auctioning, they've been having lotteries, no money lotteries. And for 15 cities, it's not unusual to have 15,000 applications filed to service these areas. And so, at the public meeting, you get down, you sit down, you write numbers, they pull as the ping pong balls up and down and what have you, of course, gas tanks and so forth. And right now, the lawyers are getting very rich and people filing applications. A lot of these systems are coming on stream, and it's moving along rapidly. As a matter of fact, only a matter of weeks ago, the Commission has given more spectrum than cellular. There's going to be a shakeout in the industry, I suppose, over a period of time. But it's moving along quite nicely. The marketplace is pretty heavily dominated from stuff coming across the Pacific. So, D.F. Johnson Company, I used to work for a couple of weeks ago, now concentrating on the base station and things, and letting the ships across the producer across the farm fight out the mobile business. Next slide. This is what one of the Johnson's first units looked like, and full duplex, of course. Low power, probably 3-4 watts. And not only that, the transmitter is controlled by the signal strength of the receiver, so that as the mobile unit gets closer to a cell site, it doesn't need as much power, and the transmitter power is reduced. And You see two antenna terminals on these units. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. This is a unit that E.F. Johnson hand unit that's supposed to be an anti-shake case or what have you, half-watt unit to plug in the cell systems. E.F. Johnson has designed this with something called Motocom. I do see the other hand on this room. Next slide. One of the other things that the Commission did, it authorized in the private radio services the use of trunking techniques, radio frequency trunking. Those of you in telephone company know what trunking is all about. And very basically, if you make an analysis of 5 single-channel systems and look at the on-the-air time and the off-the-air time, they don't always agree. But if you could find a way of pooling these frequencies and putting all these people in one system, you could have a higher average number of mobile units on the block of channels with the same waiting time have access, or with the same number of units, you could have less waiting time. In other words, you'd have better spectral efficiency. And that's what trunking is all about. With today's technology, it's done automatically. All the driver does, or the dispatcher, is mash a button, as they say down south, and talk. And all this work is done, all the selection is done automatically. Next. In the case of the E.F. Johnson system, low frequency signaling is used. It's used below the audio passband. And if you were to bypass the filter and listen to it, it sounds like gurgling water. And it's continuous, and therefore it's always self-correcting that if a car should go through a tunnel, and as soon as it comes out, it captures onto the system again. So it doesn't go through the whole cycle. And next. One of our competitors, or our main competitor, uses one channel for signaling, and therefore a 5-channel system with that method of control will only have 4 voice channels. In recent years, the commission first started out by requiring 5 channels in trunking. Now you can get 2-channel trunking systems. Matter of fact, you even sold 1-channel trunking. Now, how can you have 1-channel trunking? Well, what you do is you put in 1 channel of trunking equipment, and it operates just like an ordinary system with unique squelch. One of the features of the system in trunking is that if a mobile unit attempts to call in and all the channels are busy, it gets rejected, unlike the systems of yesterday, and in some cases today, where you can jam a channel and play games. And then when the loading gets up and justifies it, you can put the second transmitter in, and in some conditions you can get channel assignments ahead of time. So you can program all your mobile units, and when you have the money and the volume of business to justify it, you can add more channels without calling any mobile units in for rework. But that's a kind of a story in itself. Anyway, flexibility is the name of the game. This is what an E.F. Johnson trunking, the logic trunking units look like. Those squelch control is all done digitally. And that bar is used for setting the level. Since you have no squelch, you can't unsquelch the set. So you press a button here to get a tone to set your volume control, and there are no controls for you. Next slide. Incidentally, the Johnson system latches on to a channel that's available and doesn't hang on to it at the end of a transmission. Some vendors hang on to the channel for a few seconds. The Johnson system lets go of it. So in a push-to-talk operation, the channel assignments of any mobile unit are ricocheting all over the place, and that drives the scanners crazy. Next slide. That's a mobile unit, by the way, with 320 channel capability. You all realize that as you go higher and higher into the spectrum, and you move the vehicle, the signal flutter gets more prominent. That is, the number of times it happens per distance is greater, and the fades get much deeper. So if you go from 450 megahertz to 800 to 900, you're going to get almost 3 times as many of these spikes, and they're going to be deeper. And the higher you go in frequency, the deeper these nulls are. These are cancellations that take place with signals ricocheting all over the place and hitting the receiving antenna both in phase and out of phase. Of course, when they're in phase, the signal is stronger. When they're out of phase, you get cancellation. Now, this could be a serious problem, particularly in public safety, where if a police vehicle stopped and came up to a light, you could miss a message. So in the more sophisticated installations, that is cured by, next slide, by diversity antennas from a mobile unit. And most of ours from Johnson systems use diversity at the base station anyway. And it works on the theory that if you properly space the antennas, you have enough minimum spacing. Very seldom, if at all, will a mobile unit be in a position where the signal on one antenna is the same as the other, and you have a null in one or lose a signal, you'll have it in the other. And by switching, you can pick and continually sampling, you can pick the best antenna. And the results you get with this, with the vehicle standing still, you get something like 50 dB of improvement. At 12 miles an hour, it drops to 6 dB. And at 55 miles an hour, there's some question whether it's any good or not. Some people tell me that it works slightly better when you don't use it commercially. But nevertheless, the simple systems don't use it, the more sophisticated systems in many cases do use it. And it gets around that problem, which is the nature of the beast at 800 to 900 megahertz. And you can have a situation where you can see the base station antenna, and if you park the car exactly in the right spot, you can't even get a transformer. That's how deep the nose gets on diversity cures that. Next one. It used to be in New York City, the Empire State Building was the place for good UHF land mobile antennas besides television. But then the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey put up the World Trade Center building. It used to be Radio Row. As a high school kid, I used to caddy on Saturdays. Well, we used to get 50 cents for 18 holes, and hope you get out twice on Saturday, make a buck, and get a big spender. He would buy you a 5-cent glass of lemonade. But when it rained on a Saturday, we used to go downtown New York City to Fulton Street. Anybody ever heard of Fulton Street in New York? Yeah. And I used to have a school buddy of mine who used to wear overcoats in New York on these rainy Saturdays, even in July and August. Every time he'd see me looking at something, he'd say, I know where you can get cheaper, you know. And we'd go out to the store, he'd have it there at half price. He said he on the street. Anyway, Cortlandt Street's been wiped out, next slide, and been replaced by the World Trade Center buildings, which are taller than the Empire State Building. Not quite as tall as the Sears Tower, I guess. And the big concern when these buildings were going up was that there's going to be serious shadows in certain directions, the TV signals. So, a big project was developed, next slide. RCA provided a 90-ton TV antenna installed on top of one of these buildings, multi-channel. And I'm not one of those workers, by the way. And of course, this also made a very good UHF and 800 megahertz antenna site. Next slide. And lowered the speed of the position. Unfortunately, 2 men lost their lives in this project. These were all taken from the helicopter. Next slide. And if you look very close to that rooftop, that's the Hudson River, by the way, in the background, you'll see a lot of short antennas sticking up. Those are all 450 and 800 megahertz antennas. That rooftop is so crowded now, the moratorium of mobile antennas. And they had to bring, I have a complete slideshow on just this installation. And maybe someday you might invite me back to another one of your meetings and I'll show you that story. But they had the thing that looks like the rocket launch on Cape Canaveral was all built in small pieces and assembled on top of the roof. And all the way across, of course, had to be brought up from the street level to the side of the building without any windows. Anyway, the 90-ton multi-channel TV installation, and many land mobile installations out there. Next. And there are other sites around. Next. Now we're beginning to see a combination of some cellular sites and mediocre TV sites. There's a cellular antenna one. This happens to be down in near the vicinity of Washington National Airport. Next slide. In the Mott Alley, Another project we're involved in is known as the Airphone project, and this uses 900 megahertz single sideband to provide air-to-ground communications over the telephone switch network. Next slide. And what you have in an airplane is a box, a bulkhead wall, with a wireless telephone, so to speak. And you go up to this thing and put your credit card in, you take this handset back to your seat, and you dial your outgoing calls. And then when you bring the handset back, snap it in, you get your credit card back, and across some weeks or months, you get a bill for these phone calls. This is in service now in about 300 aircraft, flying predominantly coast to coast, wide body, and also from New York to Miami. And this is on a experimental, developmental basis right now. There's some fight over whether it should be permanent or not, so it's just a thrill or a necessity. And it remains to be seen what's going to happen. Now, very recently, they started installing a similar service on the metro line between New York and Washington, D.C. There's a gap of about 20 miles where they lose communication because there are no cell sites in there yet. But if you pick up new Amtrak literature on the East Coast, we see the plug for rail phone, and that's coming along. We've had this service years ago, probably ahead of its time. Next one. Another thing that has been happening, some of the battles over spectrum, is that NASA has been trying to broaden its services, and it has an experimental satellite operating above a gigahertz, and some federally funded ambulances down in Louisiana, which are dispatched by satellite rather than by conventional methods, because in going into the outlying areas, it's not economically feasible always to put repeater sites. Next slide. And so NASA has proposed a satellite-aided mobile radio service, but more public service oriented at this time. And there are several plans. One is to provide 4 basic footprints for the 4 time zones. And a CONUS, a continental United States, complete overall antenna, with side lobes shooting towards Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Alaska. And next slide. Just a comment on the satellite-aided service. Canada has proposed something at 800 megahertz. The FCC has been proposing that, and the recent FCC action only provided a very limited amount of space for any possible satellite use at 800 megahertz. The pros for satellite at 800 for augmentation of land mobile service that basically is available for a modest cost. General Electric has done a study for NASA to show how you could overlay a cellular satellite-aided service to provide more communications, especially in the rural area. And the Commission has kind of resisted that so far. That was on over yet, but that was in the woman yet. But you'll be hearing more about it. And of course, you in the industry know we are a federally regulated service by the Federal Communications Commission. Also, that's what the name is an acronym. Next slide. Term would expire every year, so the Commissioner technically has a 7-year term. And since Ronald Reagan came to town, even that's been changed, so without 5 commissioners.
This FCC building, 1919 M Street.
And next slide. There's another building down the street called 425. But to those in the room here, most of the licensing activity has been transferred to a place called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And this is downtown Gettysburg, a busy midday or something. And it's about 85 miles from the Washington, D.C. area. It's pretty well automated facilities up there now, which is not shown in this slide. And in any event, land mobile. And even the cellular applications are now being mailed to Gettysburg for sorting and staging rather than tying up the space downtown. The Commission is gradually reducing the space in the downtown buildings. Next slide. I'm sure you all have problems with the Commission from time to time. And I just want you to know they have a very astute staff who deals with your problems. Next slide. And next. that's my story. I could go on, but anyway, that's it. Yeah, Johnson. That's right, Charlie. Advent of the availability of low-power broadcast transmitters, including also turns of wire up the coils and so forth. They had some systems in the field in 23, 24. I still have home a sample of the early Motorola one-way police mobile receiver, which really was a Motorola golden voice, bulkhead-mounted radio, without the flexible shaft that turned the railroad to maximum volume control. And all you do is reach in with a screwdriver and clip to the high end of the band. And the next version came out, and the crystal control keeps drifting and so forth. But I guess Frank Gunther tells stories of running some illegal demonstrations because he could not get special temporary authority or an SBA by the commission, going back to 29 for two-way.
There was a rumor going around that Berkeley police used the one-way system and they could not get a police. They had the broadcast and they had to play music in between the distractions. I wonder if that's not true.
Yeah, it was true. I don't know about Berkeley, but it was not unusual to have music on, so that the police officers always knew the radio was working. If you didn't have anything on there, you didn't know the radio went dead, so to speak. Of course, the carrier went off the air, then you get a lot of racket and noise. You got plenty of racket and noise back then. That goes back to the days of the streetcars and the flashing wire on the top, all kinds of racket coming out of the police and the regular radios too, for that matter. Anything else? Well, it's been a pleasure. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Annual meeting in New York, we elevate a number of our members to the status of fellow. And we try and give some of these certificates out in the field right now. And we learned that one of this year's fellows will be here tonight. At the last minute, a certificate was rushed. And I picked it up Sunday. However, you can blame this on Fred Link. He didn't do a very good job of packing it. And so if Byron Riles, am I pronouncing it right, will step forward, I would like to take this opportunity, Byron, of elevating you this evening to the status of fellow in the Radio Club of America. But I'll see you to get a new one.
Thank you.
Okay?